Let's start with something so small most people never think twice about it: the length of a hug. It seems like nothing. A second here, a second there. Who's really counting? But here's the thing: bodies count, even when minds aren't paying attention. A hug that lingers a second too long isn't an accident. It's a decision, even if it's one she's not fully conscious of making in the moment. Think about the hugs you give without thinking. The quick embrace with a coworker at the end of a meeting. The polite squeeze with an acquaintance you're saying goodbye to. Those hugs have a rhythm to them, and that rhythm is efficiency. Arms go up, contact happens, arms come down, and the whole thing is over before either person really has time to feel it. That's what a socially obligatory hug looks like. It's a formality executed quickly because neither person actually wants to be standing there holding on. Now compare that to a hug that stretches past that point, where the arms don't immediately start loosening, where there's a beat of stillness before either person moves to pull away. That extra second, that small delay, is worth paying attention to because it's not something people typically plan or perform. Nobody consciously decides, I will hug for 1.5 seconds longer than necessary to send a signal. It just happens because on some level, the body isn't in a hurry to let go of something it's comfortable being close to. This is really what duration is telling you: comfort with proximity. Attraction at its core involves wanting closeness rather than wanting distance. And a hug is one of the few socially acceptable moments where two people get to be physically close without needing an explanation for it. So when someone lingers in that closeness instead of rushing out of it, it's often reflecting something real about how comfortable, how at ease, how unhurried she feels being near you specifically. That's different from how she'd react to closeness she didn't actually want. Now, I want to be careful here because this isn't about turning every hug into some kind of forensic investigation. Context matters. A long hug after not seeing a close friend in months means something different than a long hug from someone you just met. A long hug during an emotional moment, comforting someone who's upset, celebrating something big, isn't necessarily about attraction at all. It's about the moment itself. So duration isn't a standalone signal you can read in isolation. It's one thread in a bigger pattern, and it means the most when it shows up consistently in ordinary moments without an obvious emotional explanation attached to it. But here's what's worth noticing: when a hug lingers in a normal, everyday context with no big emotional trigger behind it, that's often the most telling version of this signal. Not the hug after a tearful goodbye. The hug after an ordinary hangout, an ordinary see you later, where there's no real reason for anyone to hold on a little longer except that some part of her isn't quite ready to. That's the version worth paying attention to. So next time it happens, the hug that goes on just a bit past, where a polite hug usually ends, don't dismiss it as nothing. Notice it. Not as absolute proof of anything, because nothing is absolute proof on its own, but as one honest signal in a body language conversation that's often more truthful than words. A hug that lingers a second too long isn't an accident. It's a decision. And decisions, even small unconscious ones, tell you something real. Now let's talk about something that's easy to overlook, but almost impossible to fake the difference between full body contact and what I'd call the polite distance. There's a hug for strangers, and there's a hug for someone she doesn't want to create distance from. And the difference between the two isn't subtle once you know what to look for. It's actually one of the clearest signals available, because it's rooted in something people rarely think to control. You know the hug I mean when I say polite distance: the shoulder lean, the angled approach where hips stay a foot apart and only the upper bodies barely touch, the classic side hug where one arm goes around and everything else stays carefully separated. This is the hug of acquaintances, of co-workers, of anyone where the unspoken rule is we're friendly, but let's not get too close. And there's nothing wrong with that hug. It exists because it serves a real social purpose. It lets people acknowledge each other warmly without crossing into a level of physical closeness that would feel inappropriate or unwanted. Now compare that to a hug where her torso actually connects with yours. where there's no angling away, no careful maintaining of space, no instinct to keep hips and chest at a polite remove. That kind of full contact isn't something people default to. It's actually something the body has to feel safe doing, because full frontal contact is a much more vulnerable position than a shoulder lean. It requires a level of comfort with closeness that doesn't apply to just anyone. Here's why this matters so much as a signal the body has instincts about physical space that operate whether or not someone is consciously thinking about them. Nobody has to remind themselves to keep distance from someone they're not comfortable with. It just happens automatically. The same way you'd naturally step back from someone standing too close on a train. So when that automatic distance keeping doesn't show up when she hugs you fully, without that unconscious effort to maintain space, that's the body reflecting an ease that it doesn't extend to just anyone. This is also why context around other people matters here. Watch how she hugs others compared to how she hugs you. If every hug she gives is the same full contact, no distance keeping, regardless of who it's with, that's just her general hugging style, and it doesn't tell you much specifically about you. But if you notice her holding that polite distance with others and dropping it with you specifically, that's a meaningful difference. That's not just how she hugs, that's how she hugs you. I also want to point out something people miss. This isn't only about what happens during the hug, but about what doesn't happen. Watch for the absence of the usual precautions. No hand placed defensively on your chest to maintain a gap. No stepping back slightly before the hug even starts. No rigid posture that signals let's get this over with. When those small protective habits are missing, that absence is often more telling than anything present in the hug itself, because it shows there's nothing in her that feels the need to protect that space from you. Like everything we're covering today, this isn't a standalone verdict. Someone can hug fully because they're simply an affectionate, tactile person by nature, not because of any attraction specifically. So again, look at the pattern, look at the comparison to how she treats others, and let that inform what you're seeing rather than treating one hug as the final word. There's a hug for strangers, and there's a hug for someone she doesn't want to create distance from. Pay attention to which one she's giving you. Now, let's talk about the hands. Because if you want to know what's really going on in a hug, the hands are where the truth tends to show up. People can control their face. They can control their words. But the hands, especially in a moment as quick and instinctive as a hug, often move without much conscious direction at all. Watch the hands. They say what she isn't saying. Think about the range of what hands actually do during a hug, because it's a wider range than most people notice. There's the light pat, the 1, 2, or 3 quick taps on the back, almost like punctuation marking okay. This hug is complete now. It's friendly, it's warm even, but it's also efficient. It's the physical equivalent of a polite nod. Then there's something completely different, a hand that actually rests, that settles into place on your back and stays there without the immediate instinct to pat and release. That's not a small difference. A resting hand requires comfort with stillness in a way that a pat doesn't. Patting keeps things moving, keeps the interaction brief. Resting lingers, and lingering, as we talked about with duration, tends to reflect real comfort rather than social formality. Then there's grip. Some hugs involve a hand that gently holds on maybe fingers that press slightly, maybe a hand that curls into the fabric of your shirt rather than just resting flat against it. That kind of grip usually reflects something emotionally active happening in the moment. It's not neutral. It's a small physical expression of not wanting to just go through the motions of a hug, but actually being present in it. Compare that to a hand that barely makes contact at all, resting so lightly it's almost hovering, present in position but not really engaged. That kind of touch often reflects the opposite, a hug happening because it's expected, not because there's much genuine feeling behind it. Here's what makes hand placement such a reliable signal to pay attention to. Most people aren't thinking about their hands during a hug at all. They're thinking about the greeting, the conversation before or after, what they're going to say next. The hands are operating almost entirely on instinct, which means they're less filtered than almost anything else happening in that moment. When someone is performing warmth they don't fully feel, their words might say the right thing and their face might arrange itself into the right expression, but the hands are harder to direct consciously. That's exactly why they're worth watching closely. I'd also point you toward where on your body her hands land, because that carries its own meaning. Upper back, near the shoulders, tends to be the more neutral, standard placement, comfortable, but not necessarily meaningful beyond politeness. But hands that move lower, toward the middle of the back, or hands that press in rather than just resting on the surface, tend to reflect a level of comfort with closeness that goes beyond routine friendliness. Again, not proof on its own, but one more piece of a pattern that starts to paint a clearer picture the more consistently you notice it. And just like everything else we've covered, don't treat any single hand placement as a verdict delivered in isolation. Nerves, unfamiliarity with a particular hug, even something as simple as what she's holding in her other hand can all affect what her hands do in a given moment. What matters is what you notice consistently across multiple interactions when there's no obvious reason for the variation other than how she genuinely feels being close to you. Watch the hands. They say what she isn't saying. And if you start paying attention, you'll be surprised how much they've been telling you all along. Now, let's talk about initiation. Because who closes the distance first tells you something that the hug itself sometimes can't. The hug you don't have to ask for tells you more than the one you do. Think about how much of everyday social interaction runs on hesitation, the slight pause before a hug. The are we hugging or not moment where two people almost negotiate without words whether physical contact is happening. That hesitation is normal. Most hugs involve at least a flicker of it. But what happens in that flicker and who resolves it is worth paying attention to. There's a version of hugging where you have to be the one to open your arms first, every time. Where she waits, where there's a small delay before she reciprocates, where the hug only happens because you initiated it and she went along with it. That's not necessarily a bad sign. Plenty of people are simply less physically forward by nature, more reserved, more likely to let someone else make the first move in any physical interaction. But it is a different dynamic than what happens when someone closes that distance herself, without waiting to be pulled in. Think about what it actually takes for someone to initiate a hug. It requires a level of comfort that goes beyond just tolerating physical closeness. It requires wanting it enough to act on it before being invited to. That's an active choice, not a passive response. And active choices, especially physical ones, tend to reflect genuine feeling more reliably than reactive ones, simply because there's less room for the hug to just be a polite response to social pressure. If she's the one stepping in, angling toward you, opening her arms before you fully open yours, that's her choosing closeness, not agreeing to it. This is also where you want to notice speed, not just presence. Some people will eventually reciprocate a hug, but do it slowly, almost catching up to what's already happening rather than participating in creating it. Others move toward you at the same pace you move toward them, meeting in the middle rather than waiting to be met. That synchrony, that willingness to close her half of the distance without lagging behind, tends to reflect real ease with the moment rather than simply tolerating it. I also want you to notice what happens in ordinary low-stakes moments, not just dramatic hellos or emotional goodbyes, but the small in-between moments. A hug when you're leaving after a casual hangout. A hug that happens spontaneously in the middle of a conversation, with no real occasion behind it. Those unplanned moments are often more revealing than the expected ones, because there's no social script telling either of you that a hug needs to happen right now. When she initiates in a moment like that, a hug that isn't required by any social convention, that isn't tied to a greeting or goodbye ritual, that's often one of the clearest signals available, because there was no external reason pulling her toward it except her own wanting to. As always, context and pattern matter more than any single moment. Some people are naturally affectionate and hug everyone first, regardless of attraction, simply because that's their personality. So again, look at comparison. Does she initiate with others the same way she does with you? Or is there a noticeable difference, more hesitation with others, more readiness with you? That comparison is often where the real signal lives, more than the initiation itself. The hug you don't have to ask for tells you more than the one you do. Pay attention not just to whether she hugs you, but to who closes the distance first, because that choice, more than almost anything else, tends to be honest. Now let's talk about something almost everyone misses, because most people stop paying attention the moment the hug itself is over. Pay attention to the exit, not just the embrace. The way someone pulls back from a hug often reveals more than the hug did, because the ending is where the performance, if there is one, tends to drop first. Think about what an abrupt pullback looks like. The moment contact has lasted an acceptable amount of time, arms release, there's an immediate step back, and the interaction moves on without any lingering. It's clean, it's efficient, and it's also a little telling, because that kind of quick exit often reflects someone who wanted the hug to be over. Not necessarily in a cold or dismissive way, but in the sense that the hug served its social function and now it's time to move past it. There's nothing wrong with that, but it's a different energy entirely from what happens when the release is slow. A slow release looks different. Arms loosen gradually rather than snapping back. There's a beat where physical contact fades out rather than cutting off. Sometimes it's not even the arm, sometimes it's a hand that trails slightly as she steps back, not gripping, just maintaining contact a moment longer than necessary before fully letting go. That small trailing touch is worth noticing because there's no practical reason for it. It doesn't complete the hug any better. It doesn't serve the social ritual. It only happens because some part of her isn't in a hurry to fully disconnect. And then there's what happens right after the eye contact, or the lack of it. Watch what she does with her eyes the moment the hug ends. Does she immediately look away, already moving her attention to something else? Already transitioning to the next moment? Or is there a pause where she actually looks at you first? That instant after a hug before conversation resumes is a small but honest window. Immediate eye contact right after physical closeness tends to reflect genuine presence in the moment. She's not just going through a routine, she's actually there with you, still engaged even after the physical contact has ended. Looking away quickly, by contrast, often signals a return to normal social distance, a subtle closing of the moment that just happened. There's also the lingering hand, that small detail of a hand resting on your arm or shoulder for a beat after the hug technically ends. It's such a small gesture, easy to miss if you're not paying attention, but it extends the physical connection past the point where it was socially required. Nobody has to do that. A hug can end cleanly with no residual contact at all, and most polite. Formal hugs do exactly that. When there's an extra touch afterward, unprompted, it tends to reflect real reluctance to fully disengage. I'll say again what I've said with every signal so far. None of this works in isolation. A quick pullback doesn't mean disinterest any more than a slow one guarantees attraction. People pull back quickly for all kinds of reasons: nerves, unfamiliarity, simply being in a rush. What matters, as always, is the pattern. Does this happen consistently in low pressure moments without an obvious alternative explanation? That's where the signal becomes worth trusting. So next time a hug ends, don't let your attention drop the moment arms separate. Notice what happens in that in-between second: the release, the eyes, the lingering hand. That's often where the real answer is sitting, quietly, waiting for you to actually look. Pay attention to the exit, not just the embrace. Sometimes the truth isn't in how she holds on. It's in how reluctant she is to let go. Now let's bring everything together, because this last point is really the one that makes all the others actually useful instead of misleading. One hug is a moment. A pattern is the truth. Everything we've talked about today, the duration, the full contact, the hands, the initiation, the exit, none of it means much of anything on its own. A single hug taken in isolation can be explained a dozen different ways that have nothing to do with attraction. Context matters more than any individual signal ever will. Here's why this matters so much. If you go looking for one perfect hug that proves something, you'll either talk yourself into seeing what you want to see, or you'll dismiss a real signal because it didn't show up exactly the way you expected. Both of those are traps. Attraction isn't a single data point. It's a pattern that shows up consistently across different moments, different moods, different contexts, and it's that consistency, not any one instance, that actually tells you something reliable. Think about it this way. Someone might give a long, warm hug once because they just had an emotional day and needed comfort from anyone nearby. That's real, but it's not necessarily about you specifically, it's about the moment. Someone might pull back quickly one time because they were in a rush, distracted, thinking about something else entirely. That's not necessarily disinterested circumstance. If you take any single hug and build a conclusion entirely around it, you're not reading her, you're reading one slice of one moment and mistaking it for the whole picture. What you actually want to pay attention to is repetition without an obvious alternative explanation. Does the lingering happen in ordinary moments, not just emotional ones? Does the full contact show up consistently, not just once when she was particularly happy to see you? Does she initiate more often than not, across different settings, different moods, different days? Does the slow release and the eye contact after happen enough times that it starts to look less like circumstance and more like character? That's the difference between a coincidence and a pattern. And it's the pattern that actually deserves your trust. This is also where comparison becomes so valuable, something we've touched on throughout every point today. How does she treat you compared to how she treats other people in her life? If everything we've discussed, the lingering, the full contact, the initiation, the reluctant release happens with everyone she hugs, then it's simply who she is, not a signal about you specifically. But if you notice these things showing up with you and not with others, that comparison is where the real information lives. Attraction, at its core, is often revealed in difference in how someone treats you compared to how they treat everyone else, not in behavior that's identical across the board. I also want to leave you with this. None of these signals exist to turn you into someone who's constantly analyzing, constantly overthinking every interaction, looking for proof instead of just being present in the relationship you're actually building. Body language is useful information, not a replacement for real conversation, real vulnerability, real clarity between two people. These signals can tell you where to pay attention. They can't replace actually finding out how someone feels eventually through honesty rather than analysis alone. So take everything we've covered today not as a checklist to run through mechanically, but as an invitation to actually notice the person in front of you consistently, honestly, over time, rather than searching for a single moment to hang your certainty on. One hug is a moment. A pattern is the truth. And the people who understand that difference are the ones who read others accurately. Instead of just seeing what they hope to see,